second round with Walter Block on the Anarchy debate. However, we are unable to do this debate because Mr. Block has been unwilling to use the same format he agreed to originally, and he's unwilling to answer any questions in the second round, and he's also unwilling to do the debate on my channel. So I'm going to do an analysis of the debate we had for the benefit of all the YouTubers and anarchists that I did the debate in the first place, so they can have a chance to examine their thinking and see if it makes sense or not. In the beginning of the debate, Mr. Block said that under anarchism, people had the right to secede, and there would be no law of the land, no law where everybody has to do a certain thing and would be commanded by a specific law, that you get a chance to choose which laws you agree with and which you don't, based on whether you get together with a security agency or not, I guess. However, 1 hour and 45 minutes into the debate, he changes his mind and says that, yeah, you can secede, but we will force you to follow the law anyway. So that's a contradiction. And he also says, well, there will be one law that applies to everyone, like the law of the land, and that would be NAP. Now, this is a contradictory view, and that's one of the reasons why I think he's mistaken, because he has a lot of contradictions in his defense of anarchism. Now, when he says that one law would be in effect, in other words, that we would have NAP as the governing law of the land, I think that's a good beginning. However, that's not enough, because you have to have a specification of what laws follow the NAP principle and which don't. In other words, you have to have objective law. Just saying NAP, there's still a lot of work to be done, and if you have 100 different interpretations of whether in this case somebody is initiating physical force and somebody isn't, and you have 100 different interpretations about who and how the law should be enforced, then you have a whole bunch of disputes, and inevitably some of these people will use force to enforce their conclusion about what should be done. So his conclusion at the end of the debate, about 2 hours into it, that there would be one law that applies to everyone, I think that's a good beginning. But you have to have a specification of what the law would be, what is the objective law in every area of life following that principle, and you have to have a entity that enforces it, and guess what? That's a government. So that's the first problem with his position in the debate. He changed completely from the beginning to the end. Now, during the debate, I explained why, under anarchism, we are led to gang warfare, civil war, incentivizing criminality, and also losing the benefits of the free market. He contradicts himself when he tries to defend against my arguments that I present. So the first argument is very simple. It has to do with people that are decent, good, rational people. They form alliances, they have defense agencies, and they have disagreements. Now, sometimes some of these agencies will be willing to arbitrate any issue all the time, but some won't, and he agreed, some won't. He calls them bandit agencies, bandit security agencies. Now, these bandit security agencies sometimes will decide to enforce what they think is just, and the other agency that's representing the other person will resist, and that will create a mini war, and that leads to civil war, gang warfare. That's the first way. So on this point, he contradicts himself, because he says, in the beginning, he says that defense bandit courts will attack other people, the ones I just mentioned. But later he says defense courts would not attack people. That's a blank, point-blank contradiction, and he's absolutely mistaken. Then the second way in which you end up with civil war and gang warfare is that criminals, which are now militarized, they're not like your regular criminals of today that don't have tanks or bazookas or drones or everything. These guys are incentivized to increase their military power so they can overpower more people. The stronger they are, the more people they can overcome individuals and weak security agencies that don't have armies that are sufficiently strong to resist them. Now, he agreed first at 1 hour and 32 seconds that criminals would attack individuals and weaker DROs, the defense agencies. But later at 1:36, he said the criminals would never dare to attack any DRO. That's a point-blank contradiction. And of course, if you contradict yourself, you parry the thrust of the argument. But you have to consider this is the argument, and you have to have some kind of explanation for it. This is not just scare stories or maybe this will happen. I'm explaining why it will necessarily happen. Against all odds, it'll happen. And there's one more way it will happen, okay? That you'll go into civil war or gang warfare. And he contradicts himself on this point as well. I give you the example of the tyrant, like North Korea, that sends the extortion note to pay up. First he says, well, if the DRO is weak, they have to pay. So that's not a very good consequence, because that means all your wealth is going to be siphoned over to North Korea. But then he came up with a different idea. No, we won't pay, because even though we don't have nukes, we will have sufficient military power, conventional forces, to overpower North Korea. And guess what? You know how much that's required? Because the United States in the Korean War was not able to overpower North Korea, in spite of being the strongest military on earth. And guess what? Let's suppose he's right, that these DROs do have armies, air forces, navies, etc., and they could deter an attack from North Korea. Well, then you end up in the other problem. That's the whole point of this. Then you have inside the United States hundreds of armies, air forces, and navies representing hundreds or thousands of DROs, and they will have differences of opinion. They will have conflicts. They will, like I said before, one will think that the guy they represent is not a murderer and they won't let you take him. The other group thinks he is a murderer and they try to take him by force. And they will resist the force of the first group, and that will create a civil war, because when you have armies inside your country with disputes and one of them starts force, maybe in good faith because he thinks he's defending justice, like all anarchists would like to do, it ends up in a civil war. That's the whole point. Now, he tries to dismiss, and well, he actually accepts that there is a risk. He says a risk of civil war. I think it's almost a certainty. And then he tries to dismiss this as something that's not too important, because he says we already have civil war. My goodness, do you know what a civil war is? Apparently he doesn't know. It's the greatest calamity that can happen to any country. The greatest calamity that happened to the United States was when we had a civil war. This is the worst thing that could happen, and you have to avoid that at all costs. We don't have a civil war. Go outside, go into your neighborhood. You see there's no tanks, there's no armies, there's no shooting with machine guns, etc. It's peaceful. Now, I made this point in the debate. We don't have to incur in this risk of a civil war. I think it's a great risk. It's almost a certainty. With so many DROs and security agencies, it's almost sure that they will have difference of opinion, and somebody will resort to force. He will use. He said, I'm not going to arbitrate. It's my son that's involved. It's my wife. It's my friend. It's a great customer. I promised him that I would defend his rights no matter what. And they will use force to enforce their judgment. And people have difference of opinion on all of these issues. And there's thousands of differences of opinion every day in the United States. In case you hadn't noticed, we're a litigious society. So this is what happens when you have anarchy. It ends up in gang warfare or civil war. And as I said before, it incentivizes criminals to military up, to get hardware so they can extort and rob more people. So eventually your individual rights are less protected. Now, one of the big problems in this debate is that Mr. Block does not understand, and apparently many anarchists don't understand, that all political discussions involve the following pattern. I'm in favor of this political system because it will produce goodness. Things will be good if we only have this political system. This is true if you're advocating for communism, for monarchism, for anarchism, for limited government, for whatever system you are advocating. It's always the same thing. So he doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand that ultimately you have to validate your political position, and that you validate it in relationship to an ethical conclusion. That's how you validate it. So this is what I tried to explain to him in the debate, and he apparently doesn't grasp it. However, without even realizing it, that's what he's doing, because that's the only way you can win a discussion on political theory. Throughout the whole debate, he's saying governments are evil, they're bad, they do horrendous things, da da da. Guess what? Those are moral concepts. Good, evil, horrendous. That implies a value judgment. He's saying that if you have a government, bad things will happen. It will be bad. It's an ethical issue. It's a moral issue. And he claims that morality is irrelevant. So, for example, he says that libertarianism is not concerned with morality, but only with just law. Well, this is a self-contradictory conclusion, because just is a moral, ethical concept. Just law means that this law is fair, it's good, it's ethical, it's moral. That statement is self-contradictory. In order to prove that what you advocate is a just law, you have to advocate what is justice, and justice is an ethical and moral principle. So he says that at 1 hour and 56 minutes, he says he's not interested in moral questions. But ultimately, that is what this debate is about, whether anarchism is better or worse than limited government. Better in the sense that it leads to achieve a ethical value. And in order to do that, you have to identify, like I said before, your ultimate end, your supreme good, your ultimate value, and you have to start from there and show how this political system results in goodness. But he doesn't understand that. Now, he tries to use this idea that morality and ethics are separate from political theory or politics. And he uses it to try to avoid answering questions. So he tries to cop out and avoid answering questions. He said, it's not just to ask him questions about ethics. His views on anarchism and libertarianism basically are disconnected to his argument. In other words, he doesn't think that his views on ethics have anything to do with this discussion, when in fact they have everything to do with it. And that's why I brought in morality and ethics, because you have to validate your position. You can't use that as a cop-out to just not answer a question. And we'll get into that later. He makes this explicit at 2 hours and 10 minutes. He says, you don't have to integrate everything. Basically, that's a description of his mind. He hasn't integrated his politics with his ethics, and that's why it's self-contradictory, and no wonder he can't see the flaws of anarchism. Now, he doesn't understand, for example, the purpose and context of NAP, or its relationship to the rest of ethics. That's the problem. When he is asked whether he would violate NAP under extreme duress, he says at 1 hour, he says, first he will not answer, then he doesn't know. This is the result of a disintegrated view. At 1 hour and 8 minutes, I ask, when he's asked if he would do something he thought was wrong, he says he might. In other words, he doesn't even grasp the purpose of ethics. He doesn't understand that you make this effort to understand what you should do in order to follow it. It makes no sense to go through this debate to decide which is the best system if you don't ultimately try to implement it. It doesn't make any sense with regards to any ethical conclusion. All ethical conclusions make sense. It makes sense to try to find out what the truth is in order to implement it. There's no reason why you would knowingly, willingly violate a conclusion that you have arrived at that you think is the right thing to do. You might by mistake, but knowingly and willingly, intentionally, there's no reason to do it, because you just harm yourself. If your ethics are integrated and your ethics lead to your own, maintaining your own life and happiness and having a good life for yourself, then if you violate your ethics, you only screw yourself. And that's why it's ridiculous to think that you should do it, or you would do it. But if you have an ethics that is not integrated, now you have a problem, because the practical and the moral are in conflict, and it might be very practical to violate your moral principle, but that is just the evidence of a unintegrated, self-contradictory ethics. And that's why I've been insisting and trying to suggest to everyone, integrate your ethics. That's the main thing you need to do. Let's deal with his flagpole example for a moment. This flagpole example is very helpful, and he brought it up. It has to do with the issue of duress. If you fall out the window and you have, as you're falling, there's a flagpole, you grab onto it, the owner of the flagpole says, hey, let go of the flagpole because you're violating my rights. So he doesn't know what he would do, whether he would let go or not. I'm telling you, I wouldn't let go for sure. He could sue me or try to shoot me. I'd try to dodge his bullets, but I'm not going to let go for sure. And he doesn't understand why this is a valid question. In fact, he says what I said before. He says, look, this is not a fair question for a libertarian. I think there's questions that are fair for libertarians and questions that are fair for other people, and they're different. No, I interview people and talk to people as human beings. And if it's fair for one, it's fair for all. And basically, it's just a cop-out, like I said before. He doesn't want to answer the question. And he thinks it's irrelevant, but it's very relevant. And the fact that he doesn't know could lead to his own destruction. And that's what happens when you advocate a mistaken political theory. You're advocating for your own destruction. So make an effort to figure out if your political theory is true or not, and debate it with the people that disagree to see if it holds water. That's what I do. Now, I get a lot of flack for that. A lot of people seem to hate me because I'm willing to go out there and just tell people what I think and why I think it. I think it's totally undeserved. And in fact, these people are the main beneficiaries of everything I'm saying and discussing here, because it gives them a chance to examine the reasoning on which they're basing the political theory that they're advocating, if they're serious about it. So what happens with this this flagpole example? Well, I think this flagpole example is really helpful because he also thinks that the guy in the apartment is justified in shooting you. My goodness. Just because you're hanging on his flagpole? And that you would not be, he would not be committing a crime if he shot you. Let me tell you something, Mr. Block and all the other anarchists. If you shoot somebody who's hanging on your flagpole, in many jurisdictions, if not most, you will be guilty of a crime. Not like he says that you're not guilty of a crime. You'll be guilty of a crime, homicide. And that is a very good point to understand what I tried to explain before. Different jurisdictions have different conclusions about how to handle this situation. It depends on whether you apply Virginia law, Texas law, Sharia law, common law, Napoleonic code law, and they will have differences of opinion. In an anarchist society, it's up for grabs what the law is, not to mention how to interpret it, how to apply it to these facts. That's the main problem with anarchism, that you don't even know what law you have to reference to. So you will have the situation where you'll have differences of opinion between agencies or individuals. Each of them, everybody thinks they're right, just like Mr. Block thinks he's right, and they will defend to the end. That means with force their view, and that ends up in many wars, and finally civil war, gang warfare, the destruction of our society. Here, not some other place where we can watch it on TV, right outside your window in your house. So this is why this flagpole example is very useful, because it shows you just one little quick example of what happens on this particular factual scenario, how there's differences of opinion, different jurisdictions have different views, and all you need is one of them to decide, say, I'm not going to arbitrate, I know I'm right, I'm not going to go to jail for shooting this guy, come and get me if you want, and my security agency's backing me up, and we have an army. Go ahead. Huh? What are you going to do then? You're going to send your army or not? Some will send the army, some won't. That's the situation of anarchism. He gives another example about, he thinks that proves that there isn't implied consent. The example that you go to Harlem every day, and every day you're mugged, and you keep going to Harlem. And he asked, did you consent to the mugging? And no, you didn't consent to the mugging, but I have to ask you these questions, so I think this example proves the exact opposite. Why are you going to Harlem? Why don't you just stay home? Why don't you go somewhere else? Well, if you're a sane, rational person, the only reason why you're going, even though you've been mugged several times, is because you are trying to acquire some kind of benefit there. So basically, when you go to Harlem, you've accepted the risk of being mugged as worthwhile. And this is exactly what happens when you accept a system, a government. You accept the risk that maybe they will depart from the proper function, which is to protect the individual rights of the citizens, and they will deviate. That's why you have to be vigilant. There's a risk there. But people, almost everyone, realizes that it's better to accept that risk than end up with the gang warfare and civil war that I talked about before. So this example, I think, actually proves the opposite. It gives you a good analogy of what it is that happens when you make a decision to accept a social organization, a social institution like the government. And it's true that they can deviate, but it doesn't mean that you haven't consented to the system. You consented to the situation knowing that they could abuse it and they could deviate. We started out as a constitutional republic, with limited government, a pretty close model to that theory, and that's on that basis I have consented to the system, but it has deviated, and if it deviates too much, I get the hell out of here. If it goes into totalitarian dictatorship, then I'm finished. I can't talk anymore. I can't explain. I can't defend my individual rights. I can't defend a limited government without risking my life. Then I start to look for another place to go. And in my scenario, I have actually offered anarchists the possibility of not having to go anywhere, to transition into a place right here in the United States. And guess what? They don't seem to be very interested. Now, they prefer to keep going to Harlem and getting mugged every day instead of having a situation where they're not mugged. Instead of staying home or going somewhere else, they want to go to Harlem. They want to accept this risk of being mugged, which is kind of interesting because it seems like they're not too sincere in all their complaints and all the abuses that they are complaining about, everything that they're saying. Different than me, because I would want to go to a place that is limited government, much closer to the original model of the Constitution of the United States, where we had a very small government dedicated to the proper functions of government only. We paid very low taxes, and I would try to move to one place that already had a nuclear launcher so that we would be protected against attack. That's one of the problems that I've explained. These anarchists, under anarchism, don't realize the world is a dangerous place, and if you don't have a deterrent, and the maximum deterrent is nuclear weapons, you are subject to that extortion note, to robbery that I said before. Anyway, if you are arguing something that doesn't make any sense, you will often make ridiculous statements. It's called reduction ad absurdum. And here are a few examples of the ridiculous things that Mr. Bloch had to say in order to advocate his position. One, that an individual can be a government. In other words, he doesn't even understand that the option of a government has to do with what social organization you are going to choose. That means many people in a particular area, how are they going to live? Is there going to be any law or not? Is there going to be an enforcer of the law or not? What is the situation? One person cannot be a government. Secondly, he said that the U.S. Civil War was not a civil war. Well, yes, it was a civil war. Of course it was a civil war. It was a devastating civil war. It's the worst thing that happened to the United States in the U.S. history. And the fact, and I agree with him on this, that the North was wrong to go to war with the South and that they should have permitted the South to secede is irrelevant to the consequences of the war and whether it is a civil war. It was a civil war. The consequences were horrendous. And that's the kind of thing that you have to avoid at all costs. And that's why, even if you think there's a small risk, when I think it's a pretty certain risk, I've explained why it necessarily results in civil war and gang warfare. But even if you think it's a small risk, it's not worth it. Absolutely not worth it to have war in your neighborhood. That's the issue. And if you accept or go for limited government, you have no need. And I explained to you and the moderator that apparently didn't understand. If you have a limited government, you do not engage in any defensive wars. And we're talking about the United States. Should the United States go for anarchy or not? We're not talking about Somalia or some other country where no, we are American citizens, we live here, we have to make a political decision. Should we go to anarchy or not as a system? And I'm telling you that under limited government, there's no chance any country is ever going to attack us, because we are the #1 superior military power with a nuclear deterrent. And so we don't have to worry about anybody attacking us. Some other small countries might have to worry, but we don't. That's the point. And also, we won't have to accept the risk of a civil war, because there's only one military power. There cannot be any dispute with yourself. You are the only one. And so if you have a commitment by the people that it's in everybody's self-interest to defend other people's individual rights, and that the government's proper function is to protect individual rights of the citizens, we wouldn't be involved in all these stupid wars around the world, and we wouldn't have this neocon policy of going everywhere and doing that. So I think there's one last thing to do here, and you might have to do it on your own. It is to examine the non-aggression principle. That is, what are the questions you have to answer? And you have to answer them properly in order to be able to apply it properly. The first question is it a starting point in ethics? It is not. It's just an intermediate principle with a specific purpose. It is not an irreducible primary. It's not a dogmatic command. It's not a command from God. It is a rule that's helpful. What are the assumptions under which this rule was created? The assumption is that there is a government. That's the assumption. That's the context. That there is a government that is limited to protecting your individual rights. Under that assumption, the principle works very well, except in the situation of extreme duress. And that's why I brought up this question, because a lot of people, why do you talk about extreme duress? To drive home the conclusion that this principle is not an irreducible primary. It's not an absolute. It has a context in which it should be applied. It works well in that context. And when you examine the issue of extreme duress, you realize, well, wait a second. This principle doesn't actually work very well when we're under extreme duress. That's an exception. That is not the context in which the principle works. You got it? So once you get that in your mind, then you can know that, well, what is the purpose? What is the context? The purpose is to protect two essential values that you need in order to have a long, happy life, which should be your ultimate value, your own life. What are these two intermediate values? The freedom, the right to follow your own judgment. Because somebody puts a gun to your head, you cannot follow your own judgment. That's what the great discovery of this principle is. The main way that people are forced to go against their judgment is because somebody threatens force. And then, of course, the obvious, if somebody shoots you in the leg, you can't walk very well. So your bodily integrity is protected by implementing this principle of the non-initiation of physical force. So once you grasp that it's a contextual absolute, it's absolute within that context, not another context, you're on the road to figuring out when it is applicable, when it is not. And if you try to apply it to invalidate the assumptions that were there in the context in which it was created, you are guilty of the fallacy of a stolen concept. In other words, you're trying to use a concept that was developed in a particular context to invalidate the context, the assumptions on which it was based. And that's why you reach a ridiculous result that you would rather have anarchy than limited government, because limited government implies the initiation of physical force, and you don't realize you're applying it to a context where it doesn't apply. Anyway, you're going to have to do the rest of that homework yourself. It's been nice talking to you, and I'm sorry Mr. Block was unwilling to do the debate. I tried to convince him, but he wasn't. So this is what you're going to get. And the main reason that he didn't is because he didn't want to answer my questions, and that should be an insight to you. You don't want to answer questions, or you don't answer them when you're supposed to, there's something wrong with your position.